Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights events calendar. As is customary, at the outset of each event, I'd like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome back into the house Curtis White, celebrating the publication of his new book, Transcendent, Art and Dharma in a Time of Collapse, published by our friends over at Melville House. In Transcendent, Curtis White examines the current schism in Western Buddhism. He makes a compelling argument against the growth of scientific and corporate Dharma, particularly as experienced in Stephen Batchelor's secular Buddhist movement. Curtis White asks what we want of Buddhism. He interrogates the move to make Buddhism resemble corporatism and neuroscience, embracing a culture that recognizes only capitalist and science things versus a Buddhism that still provides a refuge from a very debased world of money and objects. So Transcendent is nothing short of a call for the re-enchantment of Buddhism in recognition of a living world, defiant of our current world of climate catastrophes, pandemics, and social collapse. Curtis White is a novelist and acclaimed cultural critic whose works include Memories of My Father, Watching TV, The Middle Mind, and more recently, The Science Delusion, and We Robots. His essays have appeared in such journals as Harper's and Tricycle. He has taught English at Illinois State University. He is the founder with Ron Suknick of FC2, a publisher of innovative fiction run collectively by its authors. He makes his home in Port Townsend, Washington. Joining him tonight in conversation will be Cheston Knapp. Cheston Knapp is a writer, editor, and photographer. He's the author of Up, Up, Down, Down, a collection of essays. He was the managing editor of Tin House Magazine and the executive director of the Tin House Summer Workshop. Exhibits of his photography have appeared at the Blue Moon Camera and Machine and Blue Moon Sky Gallery in Portland, Oregon. He makes his home with his wife and son in Portland, Oregon. So before we begin, I would like to let you know we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Transcendent. We'll also be featuring a Q&A towards the end of the evening, so please do post your questions and comments in that same chat function. So join us now in giving a warm welcome to Curtis White and Cheston Knapp. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights. Such a pleasure to have you back with us.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, even if virtually, back in my city. I want to thank City Lights for the many times it's hosted me, and for generally for being there when I was young. Here's a fun fact: the first public reading that I ever did was at City Lights in 1970. I read, I think, 2 or 3 poems at an open mic session that was sponsored by City Lights. So you've always been in my heart. And I also want to thank Cheston for taking the time to come out this evening, come out virtually. I can see his avatar right next to I guess that's my avatar too. I'm not actually really here, am I? So I thought I would do a really short reading to get us off. The book is I suppose, not surprisingly, not a conventional book. It's a collection of essays, but there's wide variety in the type of essays that are in the book. Some of them are analytic and critical, and some of them are playful, lyrical, poetic. So it sort of begins with the more critical and analytic stuff, and then the book develops towards something that I think it's my attempt to show how to go inside of how art in particular has always given us access to the transcendent. So I'm just going to read a couple pages from the prologue to the book. It's called The Hard Problem of Art. I was recently listening to Father John Misty's first album, Fear Fun, on Spotify, and I noticed something that intrigued me. The songs I liked best were by a wide margin the favorite songs of many millions of other listeners. Nancy From Now On had 52 million listens. Hollywood Forever Cemetery Sings had 40 million listens. But most other tracks on the album had only 4 to 7 million listens. So I asked myself, why is that? Not why do the songs have different counts, but why am I in such complete agreement with millions of other listeners about what the most worthy songs are on this album? Perhaps it's that the songs with smaller numbers are a reflection of how many people have listened to the entire album straight through, and that the staggeringly larger numbers represent repeat listens, many repeat listens. These songs are on heavy rotation. They are algorithmic hits. So I wondered, what is it about those songs that makes people want to listen to them again and again? Ordinarily, we might explain it by simply saying they're better, or that we love that song so much. Or we might say, as many a music reviewer will, that they are the best cuts, as if that explains something. Or we avoid the problem by believing these numbers don't reveal anything other than the arid fact that for a short while, the songs trended or went viral or were shared on many playlists, a regular contagion of enthusiasm that is otherwise meaningless, a mere epiphenomenon of the digital age. Or could it be the more complicated idea that those songs are more popular because of neurology, that quite on their own, our brains experience major keys as positive and energetic, and minor keys or flatted keys like D flat as introspective and sad, and a few of Misty's songs just happen to hit the neurotransmitter sweet spot. And so the skillful manipulation of major and minor keys from which the Beatles crafted song after song, as in I'll Cry Instead, which moves so cunningly between G major and a B minor bridge, can produce a song that has been enjoyed for half a century and counting. In other words, the popularity of certain songs is only about a sort of biological demagoguery, our neural wiring saying, you will like this song, a pleasure pill provided courtesy of dopamine. Maybe that's what we mean when we say, that song is dope, man. Or is it possible to say that there is something mysterious happening within music, including popular music, something that surpasses easy understanding? Is it that Hollywood Cemetery has soul? Does it have what Jack Kerouac called it, the ineffable, unknowable, unnameable moment in a sax solo, where the jazz soars, finds a certain note and holds it, hoping never to let go? Is it that this quality of it unites us all somehow, and that this unity is reflected even in Spotify's debased number chasing? Why does it feel to us that listening to this music is not something that we do, but something that happens to us? In which case, it's not about numbers or brain chemistry at all. It's about Chuck Berry's Dionysian roustabout song rock and roll music, dancing, drinking from wooden cups, listening to my man wail on the sax, everybody shook up. Or consider the experience of singers in the gospel choir. There's nothing mysterious in their singing, it's right there. The choir feels that spirit moving through it, and they're right. It is spirit welling up, spilling over, and put into our laps.
All right, I guess that's where I come in.
Ta-da.
Ta-da! We're clapping for you. That was great.
That, virtual ovation is amazing. It's
Yeah,
really thrilling.
I'd stand up, but I don't want to Jeffrey Toobin the place. So we're going to start. I'd love to hear a little bit about how, and I think people are here because of the long first chapter, largely, right? That diagnoses what you see as a problem within the Buddhist community. Not being a Buddhist, practicing Buddhist myself, I'm curious to hear how your issues with a kind of movement toward productivity geared Buddhism sort of frustrated you, and maybe seems to have led to the writing of a long critique of, I guess Stephen Batchelor is the sort of main culprit of an atheistic Buddhism. Could you talk about that and the mindfulness movement, and maybe like how you see that as a thin development within Buddhism?
Sure.
Yeah.
The essay that Cheston is referring to is the first essay in the book, and it's called Beyond the Debased Buddha. And you know, my presence within Buddhism has been going on since for the last 40 years. I was introduced to it at the Zen Center in San Francisco. And in that time, I have, slowly grown as a Buddhist. And in the last decade and a half, say, it has really felt like a part of my life that is extremely important. It's a real presence in my life. And so that essay took me probably 10 years to write, because I kept starting it and stopping it and starting it and thinking. I came so close to throwing it away any number of times just because I didn't know what my place was within the community to launch a critique of something that is so popular now, namely mindfulness-based stress reduction, secular Buddhism, and the corporate Buddhism of Google, the Search Inside Yourself Institute, and Amazon, it's the Amazon Health program. So I was never quite sure what my place was in relation to that, even though I was deeply suspicious of it. Deeply suspicious because I sort of know the long history in the West of science's relationship to the arts and to religion in particular. It hasn't been a good relationship, needless to say, but going back to, I suppose, at least to Darwin and Thomas Huxley, otherwise known as Darwin's bulldog, the argument was that it's okay to have religion in the English classroom as long as it has first been edited by the sciences. Later in the century, you had the philosophy of Auguste Comte, who created positivism. And his argument was basically that, well, first there was religion, the religious era, then there was the metaphysical era, by which he meant philosophers like Kant and Hegel, but he also meant, I think, the arts. Who has the right to make a truth claim was his basic question. And then the final era, which makes the other two eras, the religious and the metaphysical, irrelevant, was the science era. So that continued into the 20th century, as we know, through neo-positivism, the early work of Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell, and then into analytic philosophy, which is still dominant in the Anglo-American university, and most recently in the work of the so-called new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and more recently, Stephen Batchelor. So I examined very closely, and it's not possible for me to reproduce the argument that I make, especially of Batchelor's book, called Beyond Buddhism, by the way. But the thing in general that most irritated me about that whole history, but the secular Buddhists in particular, was their insistence, their brusque, their offhand insistence that there is no beyond. Everything's physical, everything's mechanical. If there's something called consciousness, it will be explained by neuroscience. If there's something that seems to us like the spiritual world, that will also be explained through neuroscience. So the idea that there is no beyond struck me as not only wrong, but unhelpful to people in the present, in particular in the present, when we have so many crises going on, who could certainly use the refuge offered by a sense of the spiritual or the transcendent, just for the purposes of getting through their days. But the main argument I make about transcendence in the book is that it's nothing special in particular. It's very ordinary, beginning with what I call everyday transcendence. So I say that we couldn't get through a day in our lives without transcendence because, we love people. But what does love mean? It doesn't mean anything. No one has an idea what love or beauty or the mind are. These are words that are markers for something that we don't know. And yet they're totally, it's mystical. I mean, the way that William James described mysticism was that a mystical experience is something that's ineffable. That is, you can't really explain it, but all important. And in the same way, the love that we feel for our families, or even for our pets, or the natural world, or art, that love is ineffable. We can't explain it. And so that's a large part of the reason why I wanted to write a book about transcendence, even though I have no particular religious or philosophic expertise in the area. I am just what I think is a lively mind trying to explain things to myself. So that essay was really written for myself, trying to explain things.
Yeah. One of the more compelling things to have watched in this sort of suite of books that you've written over the past maybe 8 years is to see you sort of not bat an eye at an lack of expertise, or like your willingness to tilt at things that you might have otherwise felt inhibited by. So can you talk a little bit about what I see as like a sort of reveling in your own sort of sense of freedom, and maybe how that's related to the book?
Yeah,
You seem to be playing and riffing in this book and in the last few sort of more freely, and I just wonder if that's grown out of your Buddhist practice, or just if you could speak to that for a little. Speak to that.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is accurate. I'm sort of a critic of the idea of expertise in general. There was just an essay published last week in Salon magazine, online magazine, which has attracted quite a bit of attention, about the Buddhist cult of expertise. So someone like Rick Hansen, author of Dharma, can write a book, and there'll be 8 pages of blurbs from any number of very recognizable names like Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, etc. And everybody is carefully labeled with a doctor or MD or psychologist. So it's as if they're saying that these are not only blurbs, but they're expert blurbs. So what my history is simply the history of a writer with I hope what is a lively mind, and I've always been I've always well, on the one hand, I'm a critic, and I think I'm a pretty good ideology critic and a close reader of text. But on the other hand, I'm very much captivated by the history, part of the history of art, which is playful. And in literature, that means going back to Rob Blaze, Gargantua and Pantagruel, and Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, and some of the modernist writers, like Italo Calvino, or Flann O'Brien, writers who foregrounded very much the idea of play. And it seems to me that the attraction of the Buddha's thinking for me is that there was a sense in which he too was playful. The play and I once heard a definition of Buddhism as the play of energy in the void. And I said, you know, we have a void of meaning, right? And so I say, yeah, that's how we do it. We play. And most of the attention for this book is going to that first analytic essay, which is really quite different essay from the ones that follow, which are more playful, which are more spiritual in a sense, certainly more lyrical. But you can kind of tell that from the introduction that I just read, that I like to play with language, and that I find it endearing, the capacity of language to make music.
Music plays a big role in the book, and especially as you sort of align it with the ineffable and attempt to carve a space out for it as a sort of proxy experience of not nirvana, but some sort of communication beyond language. To go back for a second to sort of align the critical analytical with the move towards the arts, to founding the sort of, you know, I was thinking of Herzog. Moses Herzog wrote a book called Romanticism and Christianity. And I kind of feel like this book could have had an alternate title of Romanticism and Buddhism. You know, there is a very, there's a strain of the Romantic movement, particularly in the English poets, that you trace the West, particularly America's welcoming of Buddhism to these Romantic poets. Could you speak, because that's kind of the crux for me of like how the arts and Buddhism align in the book, is through the expansive sort of, you know, romantic move. Could you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, a central question that I ask in the book is you know, science says that Buddhism should be based upon science. That's what American Buddhism or these characters that I've been talking about describe it. But I'm more interested in this question, not basing Buddhism upon the arts, but asking this question: why was it that we seemed so open to Buddhism when it arrived on our shores in the 50s and 60s through people like D.T. Suzuki or Shunryu Suzuki? Why did it feel as if Buddhism was something that had been returned to us, and we were sort of rejoicing in the rediscovery of something that we'd already known? And so my argument is that one of the reasons it felt like that is because, in fact, we had been working with something very like it, and the counterculture in particularly knew it well, and that is the tradition or the lineage of Romantic poetry, starting with William Blake, an obvious suspect here, but moving through the English poets as well, and the German philosophers like Schelling, up through Nietzsche and the modernists. So, you know, again, it's a long argument, but it's done in some detail. But the general thrust of it is that the arts and Romanticism in particular served as what they call a Dharma gate. We moved through it in order to welcome Buddhism, which isn't at all to say that Buddhism is dependent in any way on the arts, but it's how we made our way to it. My strong feeling is that Buddhism doesn't need anything. Dharma doesn't need anything. It doesn't need science. It doesn't need the arts. Dharma is Dharma. But for us, you know, those two things are cultural presence. The arts, the tradition of the arts, the tradition of spirit in our country, the Concord Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson, etc. That's a really important part of who we are. It's not just this place. A lot of people assume that the only way that Buddhism can be assimilated in the West is that if it looks familiar to science. But I say that's nonsense. You know, it wasn't science that welcomed Buddhism to our shores. It was the counterculture, and the counterculture was deeply rooted in the traditions of play and art that Romanticism represented.
Yeah, and that it's so fascinating to watch you you flesh it out in the book, this argument. I mean, it's kind of, asking you to summarize it is a little bit tricky, but I mean, one of the neat things to see, and one of the is just how this Romantic movement has continued, right? Like we're still seeing the flowering of what was started by Blake and going back. And some of the interesting places where it pops up are in people like George Carlin, for instance, who one of the spirits I think that you're channeling is a kind of pointing out delusions in the same way, or pointing out hypocrisies, or just bad faith, right? You're looking at and sort of calling a spade. And so I'm wondering, how is it that Carlin is sort of continuing or carrying the torch, someone like Carlin carrying the torch of the Romantic movement?
Yeah, that too is in its own way a very playful essay. I actually wrote the essay originally for Lapham's Quarterly, although it turned out that it appeared in the book before it appeared in Lapham's. But it was based upon a Netflix series about Carlin. And it was riveting to see Carlin again performing. And he was, in his countercultural days, he was really interesting as a kind of court jester, anarchistic presence, perfectly in tune with the counterculture. And actually, he was what the counterculture needed at a certain point. But later in his career, he became weirdly fatalistic in a kind of spiritualized way, and began to say things about the fate of humanity and the fate of the earth that were very, very dark, or so it appeared. But in other ways, it wasn't too far from some of the things that Buddhism teaches about, for example, transience, or what is called anatman, or non-self, that, this is all impermanent. This is not, whether we manage to save the climate change problem or not, this is all impermanent. And he took a kind of peculiar delight in reminding us of that. He had a very caustic wit, but on the other hand, it was like not that far from Buddhism.
Yeah, and in this way, the sort of his cosmic indifference to what happens, right, is what you're saying maybe aligns him with Buddhism. Could you talk? I mean, I'm interested in this idea that each of us is the instantiation of, so each one mind is the instantiation of mind generally, that you get to at several points throughout the book, especially in an essay on Wagner and his development of the Liebestod love death movement. Could you talk a little bit about how, whether it's Buddhism or the arts, that is the that sort of walks that knife edge between individualism and the collective, not even collective, but just sort of general mind?
Yeah, that's a big topic.
Yeah.
I'm glad these aren't my comprehensive exams. But it's a basic teaching of Buddhism that you have no essential self. You have no enduring self. You have a self that was born into causes and conditions. In other words, born into a kind of collective karma. We were all born into a scientific, capitalistic society at a certain moment in time. For me, it was just after the war, 1951. But I've lost my train of thought there.
Mind, small mind, big mind.
Oh yeah, yeah. So that's kind of disturbing, right? The concept of emptiness in Buddhism is kind of disturbing at first look, but what it's ultimately arguing is that there's nothing to worry about. That we have to accept that everything is change. In fact, another definition that I heard of Buddhism was everything is change. So everything is impermanent. But not to worry, because that impermanence is cosmic, and that you're just part of that cosmic change, that transience. And there's a sense in which, I'm looking at you, Cheston, and I'm you. There's no difference between us. We're made of the same things. We have the same destination, and there's a sense in which to be a human being is to share your human beingness with everybody.
It's true. One of the things that I thought of several times throughout the book, especially when you move from the individual to a more collective samdi, like the sort of community of practicing Buddhists, was this choral piece by a woman composer named Pauline Oliveros. Do you know the tuning meditation?
No.
It's fascinating. It's like it's basically a group of people get together and they take a breath in and sing whatever note comes to their mind. And then on the next breath, they sing a note that someone around them sang. And so you're constantly alternating between these, and it ultimately harmonizes in this really incredible movement. But it's unscripted. You just get a bunch of random people together working on that. And my last question just has to do with how, as a community of mindful, concerned, arts-loving people, can you talk about the sort of social glue that some of these like arts or Buddhism can provide, if at all?
Yeah, that's my term was the samadhi of the collective, the calm of the collective, and it's what we're really after, I think. How we sustain that, how we achieve something like that. I'll close by telling you a story that's well known in Buddhism. One day the Buddha was invited to give a talk at a particular temple, and he went to the temple and stood before the audience of monks, and he didn't say anything. He had a flower. He just held the flower up. And everybody looked at him and sort of said, why is the Buddha talking? He was going to give a Dharma talk today. What the heck is going on here? Why has he got that flower? And then at a certain point, well into the hour, somebody rose from their seat, one person, and said, or as they like to say, moo. And the Buddha smiled, because he knew once again that somebody understood. So, for people who love the arts and love Buddhism and are attracted to that perspective on things, it's got to feel a little lonely, because the good news in the Buddha's talk was that transcendence is ever available. It's right in front of you. All you have to do is see it. On the other hand, the downside of this story is not very many, regardless of the fact that it's right in front of you, not many people see it. So for those of us who enjoy the spirituality, the transcendence offered by the arts and by Buddhism, it's not a lot of people. And I think that we have to expect that it's not going to be a lot of people. We can grow, and we should work towards growing a larger collectivity of the column, that, samadhi, a larger collectivity of wisdom. But in the end, we're probably going to have to take a lot of consolation in what we know between ourselves. That's where the Sangha comes in, the community of believers.
That's great. Thinking of all the people who have gathered here, just to, as a curious arts loving, I imagine a lot of people here have Buddhist backgrounds or maybe practices, but maybe we can open it up if anyone here has a question for Kurt about Buddhism or Romanticism or Wagner or Mahler. We've got a polymath here who can kind of, help us understand things. Yeah, I guess the chat's open.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Curtis, for sharing with us. I'm excited about looking for this. I was like you to comment on something. My path to the Dharma Gate down here at the Zen Center of LA was via the writings of Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Snyder primarily. Mm-hmm. And they represent kind of the into the 50s and 60s extension of the Romantic movement in a very real way. Can you comment on how they on their influence in this? Thank you.
Well, they're obviously very important, right? They predated the counterculture, but they were obviously, the first harbingers of what was going to come, and what is continuing. The counterculture has been beaten to death in the mass media, but there are a lot of ways in which the counterculture never stopped functioning. You go to a farmer's market, or at all of these sort of civil rights movements because for me, the counterculture was a vortex of energy. It wasn't just hippies. It was a vortex of energies that included feminism and the civil rights movement, etc. So the beats were just, so important. I mean, Kerouac was a very compromised character, but he had his moments. He had his moments where he saw clearly, and especially in Dharma Bums and On the Road, there are a lot of those moments. And I read you the one with Cassidy. There's a couple more Cassidy bits in here that are just gorgeous, because the thing that's gorgeous about him is that you know exactly what he's talking about, because you have heard that music too. You've heard that music, and it took you somewhere that you didn't understand, but that you loved, and it kept you coming back for more, even though it, in some ways, harder and harder to find these days. Yes.
Was there another one?
Yeah, right there, that one.
We can't. Everyone's got a different screen. So if you want to just speak up, I think that's Sherilyn. Why don't you unmute and give us the question.
On. Okay, here we go. Hi. So, I sort of known Stephen Batchelor like for 20 years, I guess, and met him way back when. And I guess he wrote this book, like, the faith to doubt. And then he, was kind of talking about agnosticism. And it's like gone further and further, over. And, the sort of debate with Robert Thurman about, is there an afterlife, is there not, et cetera. And you talked about the sort of, essentialism, right? Like not on all sides, but, of sort of saying, this is it, whereas like the scientists will say, which is ridiculous, like neuroscience, the brain pathways, and, it's like, that's not answering the question, but again, it's kind of getting at this attempt to come to something certain. And with your idea of sort of the transcendent, we also don't know that. I mean, in a sense of like ultimate, right? So you're just talking about on the sort of experiential level that we experience. Like, I appreciated what you're saying about like, love and connection. And I mean, we all do have these things that the scientists can't, like, okay, great, we can track a brainwave of showing, we've got oxytocin or, all these things. But right. I guess, and then the other, and I know I'm totally rambling, but maybe you can find something in all this, because I think it's sort of a difficult subject to kind of, pin down, if we need to pin down. But so the Dalai Lama, right, has now been talking, the Mind and Life Institute, right, for a long time now about science, and the whole Buddhist idea of like, test it out yourself, sort of aligns with the scientific method. So, I mean, just to kind of anchor this somewhere, how about the Dalai Lama? Is it just a way to, well, both the Buddha saying, test it, but also just a way to kind of connect in with what's happening in the zeitgeist? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
I know I've said a lot, but yeah.
First with Batchelor, his rap has changed radically over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
In his earlier books, he talked about the essence of Buddhism being the imagination. Well, what happened to that? And in earlier books, he said that he was an agnostic, not an atheist.
Right.
And in this book, it's not so hard to see. If it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. He's a new atheist. Christopher, he must have run into them at some, British gab fest, and Christopher Hitchens took him aside and Dawkins took him aside, and they sort of says, here's what you should do. You should be a Buddhist atheist. Write a book about that. You'll get all these gigs. Yale University Press will publish your book. I mean, the new atheists have a lot of sway with correct. a certain level of culture. And to me, he just decided he was the new atheist. The thing I don't understand is he writes a book called Beyond Buddhism. Well, go ahead. Go beyond Buddhism, but don't turn around and tell us that Buddhism is really science. The nerve. And he also says other outrageous things like we don't really need the Four Noble Truths. 2,500 years of Buddhism, 2,500 years of Buddhism, where everybody starts with the Four Dang Noble Truths. And Stephen Batchelor says, nah, we don't need that. What? There was a second part of your question. I don't think I answered.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see him sort of focusing as much on science as much as sort of the philosophical, following the arguments out. I mean, he was a Korean monk and a Tibetan monk, right? So he's got like the credibility, from a Buddhist perspective, but just the sort of, I don't know, I guess just his idea of like stripping it down, like Nagarjuna, who's this very well-known early Buddhist philosopher. People don't know about him. He, it's about like the nothingness of nothingness and stripping it out. So it seems like that's something that he's trying to do. But again, it's gotten kind of like, the nothing of nothing has gotten, really essential. But the other part of my question is just about the Dalai Lama, who
Oh,
the Mind and Life Institute and the whole,
yeah.
the science. Dalai Lama's dialogue with scientists, it's.
Yeah, I don't have, I know about the Dalai Lama's occasional comments about science, and he has an arrangement with Emory University for Tibetan students to come over and study science, and Emory's supposed to send Western students over and study Buddhism, Buddhist culture at least. I was interviewed once by one of the people who run that program, and I said, okay, tell me how it's working. You got a lot of monks over, right? And he said, yeah. And I said, how many students are you sending over to Tibet? And he said, well, the program's a little unbalanced at present, So I have nothing to say about the Dalai Lama.
That's a great quote. We've got another question from Shell Goldstein. Shell, would you mind, you had your hand up?
Hi, I'm wondering, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm wondering what you make of the resurgence, the renaissance of psychedelic assisted therapies.
That's funny. I'm not, we were just talking with Peter at the store guy before the talk about that. It's weird. Synchronicity. At any rate, I don't understand enough about what's going on with psychedelics as mental health therapy or microdosing and all that stuff, ketamine therapy. I just don't know anything about it. And I don't see how it's connected to Buddhism other than, the old countercultural idea that drug experiences can introduce you to, like in Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced? It was really, have you taken drugs and seen the world for the way it really is, and seen the other possibilities that we're missing out on? Timothy Leary's sort of rap. I don't know anything about it. Does that work?
So it's a chemically induced transcendence.
Right.
Get a taste of that. It's another way of getting there rather than through Buddhism, but to the same nation.
I had a couple experiences with mescaline when I was a kid, where we would sit on the beach and bang on a buoy that had washed ashore out in Jenner by Russian River, and I would sit there listening to the echo coming in, and I said to myself, oh, so this is what consciousness raising is all about. And I was digging it, but I don't do that stuff anymore, and I was never particularly persuaded by it. But go with God.
Well, there is actually a huge upsurge of people being interested, laws being changed, even at the recreational or self-exploration level of people accessing psilocybin and mescaline. And
yeah, I've had too many bad experiences with drugs to think that I should go there again. So I'm perfectly content just to read books.
Thank you.
Are any other questions? If you can kind of hit your hand up button on your Zoom situation. You see another one? You can pop on there and just talk.
Right to your left on my screen.
I can't see it, but if you have a question, just go ahead and speak up. This chat function seems to be unpopular in this group.
It was the first fellow that talked.
Jensen.
He wants to talk again.
Thank you very much. you know, at one point you were talking about how, you know, coming out of the counterculture and the moving on to the Buddhism and the spirituality of it, the beauty of it, the part that is ineffable. And I kept thinking about Theodore Roszak.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts on him. The phrase, the voice of one crying in the wilderness came to mind, but
Oh my God, you've hit one of my favorites.
yeah.
Such a smart man. Theodore Roszak was the author of a book published in the late 60s, I think, called The Making of a Counterculture. And my last book was called Living in a World That Can't Be Fixed, an invitation, reimagining counterculture today. So that book opens with a substantial quote from Roszak.
There you go.
Yeah, he was so good. I mean, he was solid. He looked at the counterculture and liked it, but he was so solid in the way he approached it. You know, nothing flamboyant. He was a philosopher, you know. One more?
Any other questions? No. Well, yeah.
Y'all were fantastic. Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you so much. Blessings. Blessings.
Turn it back over to City Lights here.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for that very engaging talk and gracing our virtual halls. I also want to thank everyone in the audience, also our friends at Melville House, one of our country's great indie booksellers. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. Best for the new year to you. We hope to see you all again soon.